We just crossed 100 participants, which exceeds my expectation for this evening. My name is Jim McCarville, and I'm the Vice President of the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. This is the first time we are attempting to do this by Zoom. Please bear with us. You will be muted during the presentation, and we hope to have activated the chat feature by the end of the presentation, and you will find that by moving the cursor to the lower part of the screen. And if chat lights up, then we are working, and we will take questions which Gretchen and Evie will consolidate and pose to the speakers. Again, thank you very much for bearing with us. I want to thank the APP, the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, for sponsoring this event and sticking with it through some trying times. I want to thank the Catholics Concerned for Change in our church and the Georgetown University Alumni Association to help promote this. Thank you to both of you, and especially to Pathways for Lay Leadership for the technical assistance, without which we never would have been able to do, and that's really Gretchen and Evie that are running the show, and John Flaherty, who proposed the promotional thing. That is, without further ado, then let me introduce Father John Osterley to, I'm sorry, get my orders right. Let me introduce Joyce Rothermel to say the prayer. Joyce?
Good evening, everyone. And with the gospel greeting of Jesus after the resurrection, peace be with you. For tonight's prayer, I invite us all to place our hands over our hearts, to feel our own breathing, and bring close to us all who are suffering in our world tonight. Let us remember Pat Fenton, Association of Pittsburgh Priests member and friend, who passed quickly from us on Easter Monday. We will end our prayer with Pope Francis's Easter blessing, to which I ask you to respond with a wholehearted Amen, Alleluia. O God, you who sent your Spirit to always be with us, we praise you with all our hearts and thank you by all our actions. Be salt and light for our nation in crisis and our wounded church. Tonight, we seek insight and direction from your beloved John Carr and one another. Make us fertile ground for this message and faithful bearers of salt and light for our country and our church. Now, with the Easter blessing of Pope Francis, may Christ, who has already defeated death and opened for us the way to eternal salvation, dispel the darkness of our suffering humanity and lead us into the light of his glorious day, a day that knows no end. Together, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Alleluia.
Hallelujah. Thank you, Joyce. That was wonderful. Technical issue, if anybody has two devices open that are close to each other, we're getting a slight feedback. You can turn the audio off of one or the other, or turn the second one off. That will help. Thank you. I think we got it. Not exactly. Okay. Let me introduce John Osterley. John, would you please introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Father John Osterley?
Thrilled to do so. Thrilled. John, we've been wanting you to come. I'm glad you're here this way. One of the greatest gifts which we receive as Catholic Christians, besides the scriptures and the sacraments, is the social justice teaching of the church. An awesome treasure, making clear the sacredness of life and all creation, calling on us to be co-creators with God in growing God's presence in today's world, as well as challenging us to take on the tough struggles in many facets of life. Some people narrow this down to one issue, abortion. But life is complex, multidimensional, as God brings wholeness and community in our world. The Church's document, Faithful Citizenship, published every 4 years before presidential elections, reminds us through the years of 24 dimensions of life that need to be considered in choosing who to vote for. John, I think you helped to create that document as much as you could. But after the cover-up of clergy sexual abuse, some wonder if the church has any credibility. What about that? And now for this worldwide crisis from the coronavirus. This evening, we are fortunate to have one of the greatest experts on the church's social teaching share his insights and wisdom. John Carr worked for the Catholic Bishops' Conference for more than 20 years, helping them develop and articulate Christ's revelation. Then he became the founder and director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. Tonight, he gives us salt and light for a nation in crisis and a wounded church, directions and dangers for Catholic leaders. John, thanks for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Father John.
John, can I make one comment before?
Sure.
We will, after John's talk, we will break into small groups, so stay on. We'll have some discussions, we'll take some questions, and we'll have some discussion in small groups. Keep in mind 2 questions. What are the main takeaways, and where do we go from here? And John, with that wonderful introduction, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, I'm already had a great night. Joyce called me beloved in the prayer, and Father John said I was one of the greatest interpreters of Catholic social teaching. I'm inclined to just stop there and say, can we go to questions? But probably not. I am really happy to be here. You've heard the cliche, there are 2 ways you tell you're at a Catholic meeting. One is there's no one in the front pew and the audio visuals never work. So we have no pew, and it's very impressive that our friends have pulled us together. So we've done a couple of these, and sort of buckle your seatbelts and hope it works. I am really happy to be here, but I have to say I have some mixed feelings. Because of who you are, lay people and priests working together to advance the social mission of the church. Because of where you are, Pittsburgh, I love Pittsburgh. I took my sons to a baseball game this last summer. I miss baseball a lot, and you may have the most beautiful stadium, not the best team, but the most beautiful stadium in the league. And through the years, I've worked with leaders in Pittsburgh. I see some on this call. I just want to mention 2. Father Jack O'Malley is a hero of mine forever. He is the gospel at work. He's Catholic social teaching in action. And when the Catholic Campaign for Human Development was under fire, Bishop David Zubik worked with us, chaired a committee, and persuaded his fellow bishops to keep that example of Catholic social teaching in action going. So you have a history of leaders. So I'm happy to be here with you for this purpose. I am a little anxious on the technology. I'm going to try and do a PowerPoint. I think that's probably 50-50, whether it works or not, because I want to quote from some of Catholic social teaching and Pope Francis, and I figure you might want to look at that or maybe get a copy of that. And the other is, I'm not from Pittsburgh. I'm not from Pennsylvania. I feel a little bit like the story you probably heard of a guest preacher at a very important gathering. That was back when we could have gatherings. And he had prepared well. He thought he had the right message. And after Mass, he and the pastor stood in the back and greeted people. And most folks were kind and complimentary. But at the very end of the line, a gentleman came up and said, you talked way too fast. You really had very little to say. And it wasn't very helpful. And obviously this concerned the guest. And he turned to the pastor and he said, who is this guy And what is his problem? And he said, oh, don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying. And so I have 40 minutes to cover this topic. I hope it might be helpful. But thankfully, I'm not there, so I don't have to stand in the back with Father John and say hello to you all and find out what you really think. Despite my outsider status, I think I'm here because some of the perspectives I bring. One is I'm now at Georgetown, and I want to give a shout out to the Georgetown alumni group and Mike and company that have promoted this. It's a great place. I've been there 6 years. Candidly, my only experience with Jesuit higher education before I came to Georgetown was paying for it. And the way the Jesuits practiced the option for the poor was by making me poor. So it's been a wonderful thing. And one of the things I've learned, our students and the Washington community has a hunger for what we're talking about tonight. We do large public dialogues. We've done about 80 of them. We've had more than 25,000 people. We do outreach to young people. We do national convenings. And Father said, this is a treasure. Well, I find there are lots of people interested in finding this treasure. Before that, as Father said, I worked at the Catholic Bishops' Conference. I worked with some of the people on the call with that. And it was a great job, but it was also in the middle of the crisis. I was the father of teenage boys. But I had the most pompous title in Washington. I was at one point Secretary for Social Development and World Peace for the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference. And I was introduced at one point to a woman with that fancy title, and she looked at me and said, you need to do a better job, especially on the world peace part. But it was a wonderful place to see the strength and vitality of our social teaching in action. So I bring some academic experience, some professional experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about faithful citizenship. I should share sort of my political background. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Minnesota Catholics, but my mother is from St. Paul and my dad from Minneapolis. That's a bigger deal than you know. But my mother's family, absolutely committed Republicans. My dad, diehard Democrats. So I learned at an early age that we can express our faith in different ways. In some ways, the most important thing I bring is my experience as a parent, as a husband and dad. The hardest thing I've done is not helping the bishops talk about the Iraq war or the federal budget. It's helping to raise kids with Christian values in this culture. And I think you can identify with this. I'm now a grandparent. That's the better part. We have 6 grandchildren under 7. And we can't hug them. And we're in the middle of this pandemic. And I have to keep reminding myself to keep perspective. I'm feeling a little caged up working at home, but I have to remind myself there are some people with no work and other people with no home. And a lot of people can't work at home because they're taking care of the sick and first responders and so many others. I was really disappointed. My daughter's wedding had to be postponed from June. And then I had to remind myself that there are some grandparents, some parents who will never walk their daughter down the aisle because of what we're going through. And I feel badly that we can't hug our kids, can't explain to a 2-year-old why grandpa can't hug. But there are some kids that have lost their grandparents in this thing. So perspective matters. Here's what I'm going to try and do, and I'll try and bring up my outline if I can find it. That's the fancy title, Salt and Light for a Nation in Crisis and a Wounded Church. Here is the outline. I'm going to begin by talking about mission, a little bit on our assets, and then talk about some directions and dangers for a wounded church, a nation in crisis, and then as far as time permits, maybe some how we can be salt and light in the middle of these challenges. Maybe some of that will have to wait for the question period. It's important to remind ourselves that what brings us together is that we're a community of faith. You are lay leaders and priests and religious who share the gospel and Catholic social teaching. We're not here for some ideological agendas. We're not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We're not the religious caucus of the Republican Party. We share a common mission. And at tough times like this, we need to remind ourselves of mission. And I went online and looked at the mission for APP, and it's a terrific mission. Diocesan-wide organization, ordained and not ordained, women and men, priests and prophets, rooted in the spirit of Vatican II, a ministry of justice and renewal. That's a great mission. I don't know who did it, but congratulations. But it's not the best mission statement I've ever seen. I put up on the screen what I think is the most powerful mission statement of all time. And it's the story of Jesus in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. The words are familiar to you. They come from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and to set the downtrodden free. What does it mean to bring good news to the poor in an economy that's collapsing? Liberty to captives when in many ways we're imprisoned in our own homes, and others are imprisoned by racism or sexism or injustice. New sight to the blind at a time when politics and ideology can blind us to the truth. And how do we set the downtrodden free when there are whole parts of our country that are disproportionately experiencing this pandemic? Jesus said, I have come to bring life and bring it to the full. Life to the full seems like a long ways away. 40,000 people have lost their lives in a month in this pandemic. And what is our role? Joyce talked about it in her prayer. We are the salt of the earth. We're the light of the world. We're the leaven of the gospel. We're to let our light shine. We're to add our salt to this. This is an organization committed to the vision of Vatican II. It's really important to remember that Vatican II, the most important document for MIDO, began with these words: the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Today, we know too powerfully the griefs and anxieties of this age. And we can only hope that we'll bring back the hopes and the joys. Pope Francis, when he was first elected, used a very powerful image. He said he wanted the church to be seen as a field hospital after battle. And some people thought that was a rather extreme metaphor. I don't think anybody thinks it's extreme anymore. What the church needs most today is the ability, in the words of Pope Francis, to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. Heal the wounds, he said. So if our mission is to bring good news to the poor and liberty to captives, to bring life to the full, to be salt and light, to identify with the griefs and anxieties, and to be a field hospital after battle, that's a massive but important mission. What do we bring to that mission? What does this organization, what do Georgetown alums, what do people working for the renewal of the church, whether in Pittsburgh or Baltimore or Washington, what do we bring to this? Well, we very often talk about our liabilities, and I suspect that might occupy some of the meetings you have. I would like to talk about our assets. And I want to talk in particular about the moral principles we bring and a leader we bring. But before that, to just remind yourself of the institutional assets we have. Think, what other organization has something like the Vatican, national bishops' conferences, dioceses around the world, 15,000 parishes in our country, 8,000 schools, hundreds of universities, at this moment, 500 hospitals serving the sick. We provide everyday experience that's being tested at this moment. Who is healing the sick? Who is feeding the hungry? Who is sheltering the homeless? Who is reaching out to immigrants who are alone? It's not just what we believe that matters, it's what we do. And we're everywhere. We are global, we are national, we are local. And there are a lot of us, people, 70 million Catholics in this country. About a third of us go to church when we can? That's not great. I hope you're talking about that at one of these meetings. But what other institution gathers 25 million people over a weekend to reflect on how they can be better people? And so we have institutions and presence and experience in people. We also have a set of ideas, a set of principles. You all know the Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. Well, we have a terrific vision. It gives us a different way of looking at the world. It doesn't fit the categories of right or left, of Democrat or Republican. With all due respect to our evangelical sisters and brothers, this is a lot more complicated than what would Jesus do. And I found at Harvard, where I was for a semester, and at Georgetown, where I've been for 6 years, there is a search among young people and all of us for a moral vocabulary that can give our lives meaning and make sense of what we're going through. And so for 125 years, the church has been trying to reflect on that gospel mission and those challenges. It'll be a relief. I am not going to try and go through all these documents in the next half hour, but I would remind you that no topic has so engaged the papacy over the century than work and workers and justice and how we're to live with solidarity. I've always said, some of you have heard me say this many times, the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word "and." Our tradition brings things together that the culture and our politics pull apart. So we defend human life and dignity. We promote human rights and responsibility. We affirm family and community. And we have a priority for the poor and the vulnerable, especially true in this pandemic. And very much at the heart of Pittsburgh Witness has been the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity and subsidiarity, and a feature. Solidarity was really the focus of John Paul II's leadership. Care for creation has been very much at the center of Francis's leadership. And we bring all that together in this notion of the common good. We had a session just a week ago. We've done 2 of these online things, one on the health dimensions of the pandemic and the other on the economic. And about a week ago, we had E.J. Dion and a guy, a policy wonk, and a woman who worked among domestic workers in New York, and David Brooks, the New York Times columnist. You probably see him on PBS. And at the end of this discussion, David Brooks, who is not a Catholic, said Catholic social teaching is the most coherent philosophy that opposes rampant individualism and should be especially relied on now. He said, what if we acted like every person was made in the image and likeness of God? And he says when he talks about this, he wrote about radical solidarity in his column. He said even atheists and non-believers rally to it. So we have a set of ideas. We also have, I think, a remarkable leader. And we ought to remember what a surprise Francis was. It came from the end of the earth, he said. And when he was elected, you know, he wouldn't go live in the apostolic palace. He wouldn't wear the slippers. He wouldn't ride in the car. And then it's apparently a sin to tell someone what happened during the conclave. There are others on the call who would know canon law better than I do. But it's a sin to tell people what happened in the conclave. So what did he do? He called a press conference the next day to tell them what happened in the conclave. And he said, these are his words, during the election, when things were looking dangerous, he said, don't forget the poor. That was said not by Francis, but by his best friend who sat next to him, Cardinal Humitz from Brazil. And then Francis said, that is how the name Francis came into my heart. For me, he's the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. So people say they find Francis confusing. They shouldn't be confused at all. From the very beginning, he was clear. He's going to be a man of poverty, a man of peace, and a person who loves and protects creation. We could talk all evening about Pope Francis. We could also talk about some of the things he has not accomplished and some of his blind spots. I think he has not found a way to talk about the contributions and gifts of women in our church, for example. And he was slow, in my judgment, to respond to the urgency of the sexual abuse crisis. I'll say that something about that later. But in other ways, he has given us a path and a way to think about our task. Francis looks at everything, the church, the economy, politics, the environment, from the bottom up, from the outside in. How do people on the margins, how do people at the bottom, how are they touched by this pandemic? He calls for engagement and encounter. He warns us against encountering the world through a screen. It's a little hard to accomplish right now. And if you were to summarize his leadership, I think you can do it pretty simply. The joy of the gospel, love in the family, the protection of all life. He opposes a throwaway society, a priority for the poor and the vulnerable every day. He reminds us of our obligations to the poor. Justice in the economy, peace in the world, mercy in the church, and care for creation. For me, there are all kinds of examples. You've seen pictures of him comforting the sick. You've seen him reach out to the poor and workers. I had the honor of being in the House chamber when Pope Francis spoke to Congress. And it was just an amazing, amazing experience. But what struck me about it was not what he said, but what he did. After the speech to the most powerful people in our country, where did he go? Not to sit down with the rich and famous or the powerful, but to have lunch with the hungry and the homeless in Washington. And so he not only said what we should do, he showed what we should do. So we have experience, we have presence, we have people, and we have a way of thinking and a leader who shows us the way. And I think that offers us some pretty clear directions and dangers to face two very, very vulnerable institutions. I call them a wounded church and a nation in crisis. So the church is challenged in lots of ways. First of all, just passing on the faith. I suspect some of the people on the call are wondering whether their children, their grandchildren, will find a way to be a part of this community of faith, the people of God, in the ways that we did after all our efforts. We certainly have challenges of diversity and inclusion and openness, whether it's the role of women in the church, lay leadership in the church, African American, especially Latino leadership in our church. And how open are we to those who have seen themselves on the fringes, LGBTQ Catholics and people with disabilities? And there is a real problem in our church of polarization and anger where some of the divisions in our politics have seeped into ecclesial life. I don't like this pick a pope ecclesiology, which is I'm a John Paul II Catholic, I'm a Pope Francis Catholic. We have one pope, and I think he's showing us the way. But we're wounded in particular, and frankly, Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. have been wounded more than most by the clergy sexual abuse crisis and the leadership crisis that enabled it and permitted that. You have probably spent a lot of time and a lot of thought on this. And so I'm just going to take a few minutes not to add another institutional analysis, but to speak more personally. I've been dealing with this challenge for 50 years. It is personal, it is professional, it is institutional. I worked for bishops. I went to a minor seminary. I now work for a Catholic university. And what I want to talk about is sort of the lessons I've learned in the last 50 years. And the first is simply there's not enough parents in the room, especially mothers in the room when these decisions are made. I worked for Cardinal Hickey, who was a great leader in Washington. And in 1981, I was summoned into a meeting where a senior cleric was accused of abusing young people. And in the room were a number of clergy and me. I had just started. And every priest in that room, with the exception of the Archbishop, said they knew Father. They knew Monsignor. This couldn't have happened. And the Archbishop had asked for an investigation. They said this likely happened. And when it came my turn, I said, I'm a parent. I'm a dad. This looks differently to me. And to his credit, Cardinal Hickey removed that priest from the office he held. But there are not enough parents. There are not enough survivors in the room when these decisions are made. So we need more lay leadership. But lay leaders sometimes enabled this, sometimes permitted it. One of the challenges is whether lay people in structures have the freedom and the courage to speak truth to power, or whether their task is to also preserve the institution. The other thing I'm going to say more about this in a minute, our lay leadership has to be more diverse than it is. It just can't be the donors. It can't just be the true believers. It just can't trade a clerical elite for a lay elite. Thirdly, our leaders are often isolated. I've said it's not so much ideology as isolation. They're surrounded by people who agree with them or are taught to agree with them, and they rarely get challenged. For a period at my time at the Bishops' Conference, I worked directly with Cardinal Law. And as I said, I had teenage boys. And when he resigned, he said to me, John, only 2 people told me to my face that I should resign, and you were one of the 2. And I said, you can be a lot of things. You could go to heaven, but you can't be Archbishop of Boston. And he said, no one talks to me the way you do. And that's not something to pride for me. That is a statement of the problem. Our leaders are too isolated. Not all, but some. Cardinal McCarrick is one of my dearest friends, and he's done a lot of good for the church. And I traveled the world with him. I knew him. He cared for me, for my family. When I heard these rumors, I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, is any of this possible? And he said, no. If any of that were true, I wouldn't be here. And what that taught me is even our friends have to be accountable. This institution has to be more transparent so that people cannot escape accountability or scrutiny. I met with Archbishop Vigano, who's now famous for his criticisms of Pope Francis and about McCarrick, about sexual abuse. And I take what he says with great skepticism, because when I met with him on another matter, I told him about a situation in my home diocese where an archbishop had enabled, had permitted, had covered up, and actually had engaged in this activity. And he looked at me and said, we can't give in to the enemies of the church. And I said, every day he's there is a problem for the church. And so when people use the sex abuse scandal to score points in other ways, be very suspicious. There's a lot of talk these days that this is a problem of celibacy or the male priesthood or Vatican II or homosexuality or the culture. And we ought to talk about all those things. But what this was and is an abuse of power. None of those things gave any priest permission to abuse children. And we ought to focus on the abuse of people, the abuse of trust, the abuse of power. For me, I was very disappointed when Pope Francis, in the aftermath of the Vigano accusations, was silent. And I found myself talking to journalists. I do that a lot. And I said, silence is a part of the problem. And then I had to acknowledge that my silence was very much a part of this problem. I was in a high school seminary in Minnesota, and while I did not experience the worst things that are in the Pennsylvania grand jury report, I faced abuse. And I didn't tell my parents, I didn't tell my wife, I certainly didn't tell my children. And I realized that my silence is a part of this problem. And it's very awkward. I was on the NewsHour with Judy Woodruff, and she said, we want to talk to you about this. And I said, oh yes, the church needs to be reformed. Yeah. She said, no, I want to talk about what happened to you. And it was a very awkward discussion. And I felt very odd leaving the studio. And one of the cameramen in the middle of the show reached out his hand to me and whispered, thank you for doing that. That happened to me. So silence is not an option for any of us. We had a major convening from people across the country, and I'll go through this quickly because I want to cover some other things before questions. We need to put victims, survivors at the center of this. That's the lesson Pope Francis learned. We need to confront clericalism, overcome that isolation, and support faithful clergy. That's as simple as what we call our bishops and how decisions are made. As I said, we need to reflect the diversity of the church and avoid a new lay elite. And we need to reform and renew our church. I'll be honest, even as a survivor, I'm not fully committed to healing and reconciliation until we get some reform and renewal. Now, we have to acknowledge that a lot's been done because of survivors, because of the media, because of some of the legal processes. There is protection. There are processes. There are leaders committed to making this right. But we have a culture that needs to be changed. And one of the biggest losses, I think, has been our voice. We are more than our mistakes and failures, and our voice needs to be heard on behalf of the unborn and the undocumented and the poor and the vulnerable. And that takes me to my second to last point, which is, how does Catholic social teaching shape our witness in a nation in crisis? And just like the sexual abuse crisis is two crises, this is a health pandemic and an economic collapse. I'm going to skip some of this for time reasons. Our faith gives us a different way of looking at this, but it turns it upside down. If you look at the Ten Commandments, the way we keep holy the Sabbath now is by not going to church. The way we honor our mother and father is by not visiting them. Thou shalt not kill doesn't involve some grand gesture. It means staying home, social distancing. Thou shalt not bear false witness. We need our president and our leaders to tell the truth, and we're not getting much of that. And who would have thought not coveting our neighbor's goods would involve hoarding toilet paper or sanitizers? It's a little upside down. The works of mercy, which you have been doing forever. It's hard to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and shelter the homeless in a pandemic. It's impossible almost to visit the sick and in prison. In Italy, we can't bury the dead, and we're not able to have funerals here. But the one thing we have to keep doing is pray for the living and the dead. So if the commandments and the works of mercy are turned upside down, I would suggest the Catholic social teaching is right side up and gives us a way to assess and act on this. And I actually wrote a piece in America on this, and you're going to get the short version of this in the next 7 minutes. Obviously, this is about human life and dignity. This is a fundamental threat to life. And it doesn't matter whether you're young or old, rich or poor, whether you're disabled, man or woman, African American, your lives are at risk, but some lives are more at risk than others. And human dignity is not something we earn by our good behavior, it's a gift. So our care, our testing can't depend on our power or wealth or status or where we come from. Let me go back here. I told you this would be exciting. So, defending the dignity of those who are hungry are biblical mandates. The people on the peripheries, the people with disabilities, the people who are disproportionately affected, people of color. We have to resist scapegoating, whether it's immigrants or people from Asia, or the old, or the disabled. So the way we protect human life and dignity is to avoid the actions, behaviors, and attitudes which spread and threaten lives. Staying away from each other, not gathering for mass is not just following government mandates, they're pro-life choices and they're moral duties. We have to acknowledge when it comes to human rights and responsibilities, the absence of human rights make all these things worse. If you don't have health care, you're more likely to die. So pursuing universal health care is not just a policy goal, it's an obligation. Assisting those who have lost jobs and income is not just part of a stimulus package, it's an ethical requirement. And responding to the global needs of a world that's going to suffer from this pandemic is not just wise foreign policy, it's a duty of solidarity. When it comes to priority for the poor, how we treat the poor and vulnerable and those with the greatest need and with the least power is the moral measure of our response. Like Pope Francis, we should look at this as from the bottom up and the outside in. And these are often not the priorities of politics and business as usual. And after all this talk, efforts to gut the safety net, we need to strengthen the safety net, which offers lifelines for families in need of food and shelter, healthcare, and essential need. Catholic social teaching begins with the dignity of work. And this is a time to hold up and not just clap our hands, but pay people who do the hard work in our hospitals as first responders, who pick up the garbage, who deliver food, who care for the sick in nursing homes, what Pope Francis calls the saints next door. So restoring work and rescuing livelihoods should be at the center of any economic plan. Solidarity is the core of our response. We have to remind ourselves we're one human family. And we ought to also remind ourselves that people hoarding or honking their horns in the streets, they're not who we are. It's the people who are reaching out to their neighbors and sacrificing for others. That's solidarity in action. And there is this old-fashioned notion, Catholic notion, of subsidiarity, which is how we divide up the world. Work it says that we ought to do for ourselves what we can, and families and neighbors and communities and towns and states ought to do what they can. But it also says we have a claim on our federal government for help when we need it. And we need help in mobilizing to overcome this pandemic and the economic collapse that comes with it. So that brings us to the common good. We need the collaboration of all sectors of society, and we need to divide up the work in a way that serves the common good. And we need less placing blame and more working together. If we don't, we're going to see more disease, more death, more pain. Here is how Pope Francis, that incredible image of him alone at St. Peter's Square, talked about the future. While we are looking forward to a slow and arduous recovery, there's a danger that we will forget those who are left behind. The risk is we may then be struck by an even worse virus, selfish indifference. He asked a series of questions. I'll send you the PowerPoint. I think these are powerful, but I want to move to my conclusion, which is what are some directions for how we respond to a wounded church and a nation in crisis? So my advice, and it'll be short and we can talk more in our small groups and in the question period, we need to integrate, not isolate, these social principles. They don't just belong to the PPA. They don't just belong to the Social Concerns Committee or Catholic Charities. They are the work of the whole church, and they're the work of all of us in our lives. And while we can't worship together, I'm praying more often. I dial in. I'm not a daily mass person. I dial in to Pope Francis each morning, and his simple homilies are a source of great strength and consolation for me. We need to share with others the secret of Catholic social teaching, these principles that can offer us a different way of assessing this. We got to act like it's good news. Ain't it awful is not an organizing tool. We can do better, motivates us, encourages us, and we can say it's really tough right now, but we can do better. Leadership is important, whether it's Pope Francis or Bishop Zubik or the pastors in our parishes, but leadership belongs to all of us. And I think there are two kinds of leadership, and we ought to watch which one we choose. One kind of leadership is overwhelmed, demoralized, depressed by all this, and sort of hunkers down and says, woe is me, and gives up, you know, because of the politics, because of what's going on in the church, because of the culture, and we throw darts and bolts of lightning at people. We're very judgmental. Another kind of leadership says we have what the world needs in these principles, in our experience, and tries to engage and persuade people. Pope Francis is an engage and persuade kind of leader. I think a lot of people on the phone and online are engage and persuade kind of people. Mark Shields, the political commentator, David Brooks' buddy, says you can tell the health of an organization by whether they're looking for converts or heretics, whether they're trying to push people in or push people away. And there are some people on the right that are looking for heretics. There's also some people on the left that are pushing people away. We need to practice ourselves what we preach to others about human dignity, about the rights of workers, about inclusion and justice and care for creation. Number 6 for me is diversity is an obligation, not an option. It's who we are, and we will not get this right if it's a bunch of white guys deciding how we're going to persuade. We all need to continue to serve the least of these. It'll be a measure of how we're judged. We need to practice everyday Christianity, how we act at work, how we raise our family, how we treat other people, what we invest in, who we contribute to, who we vote for, how we serve in the parish. We especially need in this year, and especially in Pennsylvania, to practice faithful citizenship. I think the whole country is wondering what you all are going to do, since you might elect the President of the United States, you in Wisconsin and Ohio. Let me keep trying here to wrap this up. Hold on. I always say when it comes to faithful citizenship, we should be clear what we're not. This is not about whether Donald Trump says Happy Good Friday or 2 Corinthians. It's not about how often he goes to church. It's not about the political cloud of religious groups. It's not about the Catholic vote. E.J. Dionne says Catholic vote, there is no Catholic vote, and it's really important. You may have heard the story of Mrs. O'Reilly in Chicago. She loved her faith, her family, and the Democratic Party, not necessarily in that order. And she was very disappointed. Her son had become a Republican, and they're arguing about politics. And her son said to her, "Mother, if Jesus Christ himself came back as a Republican, you wouldn't vote for him." And she said, "Well, why would he change his party affiliation after all these years?" Well, that may be true of Mrs. O'Reilly, but it's not true of most of us. And we don't fit the categories very well. And it's not about our pastors telling us how to vote. Pope Benedict had said it's about how to form consciences. And that gets us to the bishop's statement on faithful citizenship. Here's a very important line from that document. These decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and the ability to influence a given issue. Those are important criteria in this election. And people in your state are going to have a disproportionate influence. So my advice to the church, we need to be political without being partisan, not cheerleaders for any candidate, chaplain to any administration, but challenge them all. We need to be principled, but not ideological. We shouldn't give up on our commitment to human life or our priority for the poor, but we ought to work with everybody who can help us. We need to be civil, but not soft. We should not call people names. We need to be engaged, but not used. We ought to engage with our politicians on our terms. Sometimes I feel politically homeless. That's not a badge of honor. We need to build a shelter, build a home, find other people who will fight with us, fight for what we believe about human life and dignity, about solidarity, and about care for creation. Finally, we're in this together. We should resist the polarization that surrounds us. A pastor is not a chaplain to a faction. We can't just be leaders of interest groups. We should divide up the work. Pro-lifers and social justice folks, Latino leaders and African-American leaders, people who work on women's rights, people who work in Bread for the World against hunger, people who work for creation. But we shouldn't divide the church. We should act like we belong together. We should build bridges and reach out to others and act like we're one family of faith. And so my final quote is from Pope Francis: "An authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, always involves a deep desire to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this world better than we found it. Our faith, which is never completely comfortable or personal, requires us to change a church that is wounded, a nation which is in crisis, and leave both of them better than we found it." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I don't know much about sign language, but I know this means we're happy and we like what you just said. So if anybody wants to join in, just go right ahead. Okay, we've got a little better screen right now. Let's get a big round of applause for, there we go. All right.
Thank you very much.
John,
And now I'll mute myself.
John, we've got a couple of questions. Evie, have you been taking questions? And you might repeat for everybody where they can send those questions to if they have any. Evie?
Yes, we have a question from Joyce, which is, John, can you provide some concrete examples of lay leadership within parish communities?
I have to unmute. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The 5 most common words in the Catholic Church right now are not Hail Mary, full of grace. It's you need to unmute yourself. Some examples. Well, there are great examples. I mean, I think of someone, I think I first met Jack O'Malley working around labor issues, and the example of Cesar Chavez, a humble Latino farm worker who changed the earth. Lech Walesa in Poland with a union who changed the face of the globe. But for most of us, it's the service we do every day. Whether we serve on the parish council, whether we teach CCD, whether in our parish we have an active global solidarity group that makes connections. We have a sister community in El Salvador that reminds us that our little parish boundaries are not the end of our concern. I think people who stand up with conviction in politics against powerful forces are really important. I remember Robert Casey in Pennsylvania, who stood up for the unborn and for healthcare. And I remember Mitt Romney just recently, who has stood up against President Trump, both because of their religious faith. But for most of us, it's in the little things. To be honest, we have a wonderful pastor, and I only tell him I like his homily, talk about his homily when I like it, and I can encourage him, but every once in a while I have the guts to say, why aren't you talking about immigrants? He actually does, but encourage him to be stronger. I worry a lot about my kids' values, where they are at this time. So what kind of parent I am, what kind of grandparent I am. But I think elections and election years give us a real opportunity to remind people that our faith ought to shape our politics, not the other way around. And that takes guts.
Gretchen, do you have any questions?
I do not, actually.
Evie, do you have any more?
I do. I'm going to shorten it, and it's basically, it's from Jerry, and Jerry, I would encourage you to go into this more perhaps in the discussion groups, but at the bottom, I think the question is sort of challenging the idea that abuse of power is the primary problem, and sort of asking you to speak about the need for a deeper transformation of our people. One example she gave was when high school tried to introduce CST into the curriculum, parents protested, just talking about that there's other problems other than abuse of power.
Yeah, I was probably not clear enough about this. What I was talking about there was people who try and use the sex abuse crisis to advance their own agendas. Somebody who thinks celibacy ought to go and says, you know, if priests weren't celibate, this wouldn't happen, or the all-male priesthood, or some other people think sexual morality went nuts, and that's the problem. I was just trying to say that whatever the larger context, and we have a lot to talk about there in terms of the disciplines of the church and the priorities of the institution and our own convictions, none of those things gave anybody an excuse to abuse young people. And they have to be accountable for that. And this institution, which did not respond well, in many cases covered it up, in a lot of cases focused on the institution, not the individual. So I think we absolutely have to talk about a whole range of issues. I think in lots of ways, our priorities are upside down. Washington is all about the rich and powerful, not the least of these. And it shows up in our tax legislation. It even showed up in the CARES Act, where the big boys find a way to take care of themselves. I think our church ought to listen more to Pope Francis, who says we ought to be going outward, not focusing inward. That the test for the church, he says, I prefer a church which is out on the road and gets a little bit dirty than one that's closed in on itself and sick. So I think there are a lot of illnesses that need to be addressed and opportunities that need to be seized. But I just have no patience for the people who try and use the sex abuse crisis to advance their own ecclesial or ideological agendas. Sadly, priests and bishops who were on the right, on the left, in the middle, were all complicit in this. So this is not an ideological cause. This is the responsibility to protect the young, hold people who did this accountable, and change the clerical culture which permitted this.
Evie or Gretchen, any more questions? Okay, before we break into the small groups, which Evie's going to randomly assign us here in just a second, I want to thank you, John, for I asked people to look for a takeaway. And my takeaway is you've given us a redefinition of the right to life. And I think that's going to be very helpful as we try to guide ourselves through this crisis. Because the time is so short for the breakout groups, maybe we're going to focus just on the second question in these groups is, where do we go from here? And if he's going to give us 10 minutes, and then he's going to bring us back together. Gretchen, you've got to say something here.
I want to say that I had a question come in. I was wondering if we should take it.
Go right ahead.
So, this is from Jim, and he asks, not you, Jim, different one. In the wake of the abuse crisis, going forward, if you were able to give one piece of advice to Bishop Zubik and his Church Healing Commission about how to improve things going forward and heal the church, what would be your one recommendation? Now,
well, can I have two? One,
yes.
When I was muted, I was telling a very eloquent story about Juan Carlos Cruz, who actually lives in Pennsylvania, was the Chilean survivor who the Pope said was a liar, and about what happened in Chile. And the Pope retreated and sent an investigator and came back and said, you were wrong, and you need to listen to this. And Juan Carlos and others met with the Holy Father for over a weekend. And the Pope Francis said, I was wrong, absolutely wrong. And we have to listen to survivors. And then the other thing the Pope has done, when he first wrote the bishops, he wrote a fairly general statement. It did not have policies. It did not have lay people are going to do this and lay people are going to do this. He says we need to change a culture of clericalism into a culture of service and listening. And I thought that was very abstract and very vague. And the more I thought about it, those two things, put survivors at the center, and frankly, their families, and work on changing the culture, because we have focused mostly on changing the process. I know and admire Bishop Zubik, so I have some confidence in his ability to do this, but listen and focus on the culture, which means, frankly, the lay people have to step up in ways that we haven't before.
Thank you. I have a question from Archie. How do you get involvement of young people in social justice issues?
As I said, I find a hunger among my students and people come. We're going to have a session in about a week with young leaders in Washington. We call them Salt and Light gatherings. And they're for young people who work on Capitol Hill or in the administration or in advocacy. And what we try and do is talk about how their faith and Catholic social teaching can not only help them save their souls, but enrich their lives and help their work. And I'll be honest, our first meeting, I said, oh, we have these wonderful speakers, these great principals. They said, well, that's all great. We want food and drink and time to meet with each other. So listen and then respond. But we have gotten a great response. I think there is a hunger for a moral vocabulary, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's an economic crisis, whether it's immigration. So I think Catholic social teaching is actually a door that leads into larger questions of meaning. And we've found some success. If you're interested, I'll put up on the screen at some point how to sign up for our stuff, and you can go to our website and take a look at some of that.
Thank you.
Began the conversation just about the question, where do we go from here? And you know, it's coming up on 2 years. I just realized that we started to hear the news of the Pittsburgh issues, and me being from that area, it hit me, you know, even though I lived in Baltimore, I mean, it really hit me hard. And I've been praying a lot about how to find people, and thankfully I did find a group here in Baltimore to kind of get together. And I think that for myself, I'm just gradually sharing it with different people, because meaning different Catholics, family members, etc., as well as others, but how I'm sharing it because I think a lot of people feel alone. My cousin's in Canada, and when I sent her something that I shared, she reached out to me and said, I wish there was something here. She's in Western Canada, originally from Ontario though. But so for me, I feel like it's about communicating and being also ready for the attacks. My brother loves me, and I know I love him, but he has told me that my involvement in this, I'm spreading hatred, and it's really kind of challenging, because I think what he's really saying is he's fearful that priests who have not, who have been accused, you know, who actually were and are innocent, that I'm part of that. And I think he's he loves the church, and I do too, but we approach it certainly in different ways at times in terms of this. So I've been praying a lot, and I've actually asked priests that I know who to ask them, you know, what do I do? And it's interesting, my experience with the different people that I've spoken to, and the priests, that is, I notice that they're walking around sometimes and saying things because they don't want to come out direct sometimes. One of the indirect things that a Dominican priest told me was to read the St. Catherine of Siena's dialogue, because in her day, apparently she also spoke to power. So I'm about to kind of delve into that. Um, so that so I'm really, it's a combination. I find this balance between people who I feel they're still in a different stage than I am with anger, and then moving forward. But anyway, I've been talking a lot, so I want to let other people share.
Casey, welcome back. Casey and I had
Yeah, I don't know what
a
happened.
minute. I don't either. We had a minute to share, and so if you want to speak, Casey, go ahead.
And Kevin, you might need to unmute yourself whenever you're ready to talk too, just so you know.
Pardon?
Well, Corinne, you want to say something?
Yeah, I shared before that I had such a difficult time with this child abuse in the church and the cover up. I shared with Susan that I spent my entire adult life as an educator, protecting kids, doing everything in my power. I was in a very poor, for 22 years, I was in a very poor area of Fayette County. And the needs were unbelievable. And they did everything to protect those kids. And the diocese transferred a priest 7 miles down the road from a very small, very rural parish to the village where I was. And he had one of the worst abuse cases in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania. The case was written all over the newspaper, everything that he did and said, and I mean, it was an absolute horrendous situation. But they transferred him 7 miles to where there was a school, and they knew that he had this background because they had letters from the parents. The diocese had made monetary payments for issues that this boy needed surgeries, multiple surgeries for damages done by this priest. And yet they moved this gentleman down the road to where there was a school. So it makes me very, very frustrated, very angry, very, very often.
I've heard, these statements over and over again in various groups, and I agree with what they're saying. But relative to the abuse crisis, to me, the abuse of the bishops by covering it up in
Yes.
most of the time, and who knows how many participated, is much bigger, and it's it's just part of the even larger issue of clericalism. And I can't believe that that lay people are going to change things because the church is hierarchical. It always has been. It always will be. And even with
I got a technical point here. We're back in the big group, and somebody's got an echo on their
all right.
program. Okay, I think it was taken care of. Oh, shit. We lost it.
Not asking me, it's somebody else.
Somebody started screen sharing here.
Are we in the big meeting or what?
Yes, we're
Yes,
back.
we're back in the
Everyone's
big
back
meeting.
in the big room now.
Okay, Evie, can you give us a little direction?
So we should
Yes,
leave this meeting?
John, I had a question that came in on email for you. And it says that it's from Robert, and he says, I do not find the church leadership in the USA to be that supportive of workers. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly not where it was. I mean, we were a community of workers committed to the labor movement. The labor movement was committed to the church. As Catholics have become more affluent and more integrated into the larger economy, we lost that kind of personal connection. So now we have to make the case that it's a matter of what we believe about work and workers. We have one advantage in that sometimes people say, I'm a John Paul II Catholic, I'm a Benedict Catholic, I'm a Francis Catholic. It'd be hard to find three leaders in the world more committed to workers, the dignity of work, and the rights of workers. And they believe work is not a way to make a living, it's an expression of our dignity. And that unions, for example, help workers not only obtain more, but be more, have a voice in the union, in the economy. So I expect, frankly, we have now watched that the most important workers are not the people who run hedge funds or run the United States Senate, but the people who clean hospitals and nursing homes, the people who drive ambulances and are taking care of us and deliver pizza and are taking
work in grocery stores.
Yeah, grocery stores especially. So maybe our attitudes might follow our needs, and we lift up those workers. I saw one line. The two lines I remember about this situation. Somebody said, "I never planned to give up this much for Lent," and the other was a first responder says, "I could use less applause and a better wage." And maybe we could listen to that.
Thank you.
Evie, I think your group had a report and a question. I mean, Gretchen.
Yes. So this question came up about how do you feel that Catholics can and will play a major role in the upcoming election?
Well, I used DJ's line, there is no Catholic vote, and it's really important. 11 of the last 12 elections, Catholics voted for the winning candidate. And that in some ways covers over the divisions in our church, and that Latino Catholics vote very differently than Anglo Catholics and African American Catholics. But we're one of the few swing votes left in America. Evangelicals tend to vote Republican, Jewish voters, Democratic, Black Protestants, Democratic. If you were to look at a chart, and somewhere on this computer I have the chart, but we'd be here all night if I had to find it. About 40% of Catholics tend towards the Republican side. About 40% of Catholics tend towards the Republican side. Their votes are fairly predictable. The other 20% decide who's going to be president because of who they are and where they are. So, and that's a mix of, a Latino plumber and, a Catholic school teacher and an Anglo and an African-American physician. So, and we tend to be concentrated on what are the swing states in the country. So if a friend of mine said, I told him, we have ideas, we have experience, we have institution, we have people, we have leaders. He said, if you ever got your act together, you'd be dangerous. And I think, so one of the questions is, can we get our act together? And can we make a difference in the choices our country faces as we come out of this crisis and as we choose our leaders?
So I'm going to ask a follow-on question because, to be honest, after this disaster with the clergy abuse scandal, especially in Pennsylvania, I think I speak for many in saying I'm not all that impressed with our leadership in the Catholic Church, and I'd really like to understand whether I'm wrong and who you think we could, in fact, get behind, and who could step up and really unite us in leveraging all those tools that you just mentioned as our assets.
Well, can I go home? I mean, questions are going to be this hard. I mean, you know, here, you know what? This is a terrible answer, but name an institution that is well led right now. Think about Hollywood. Think about media. Think about business. Think
State of
about
New York.
politics. Think about journalism. Think about Me Too. Think about, you know, the collapse of the financial sector, and think about the demoralized politics of Washington. So it should be better. And I've worked with a lot of bishops, and they are better, and I admire your bishop. It's a tough time to be a bishop. I mean, every time the phone rings, they got to go, oh my God, what now? So, so this is going to have to be a bottom-up kind of thing. We need a renewal of all our institutions. The one thing, and this is not everybody's view, it is a real surprise to me that in Pope Francis, we have a leader who is talking about changing the culture, talking about lifting up the poor, talking about workers, talking about going out instead of turning inward. So none of our institutions are in great shape, but I think we have assets, as I tried to explain. If you said to other institutions that we have a way of thinking and we have a set of institutions, I mean, think about who is making a difference. A journalist called me and said the church is closed down. You know, what's going on? And I said, the church is mobilized. I mean, we're feeding hungry people. We're sheltering people every night. What we are not doing is able to gather together every weekend. But a lot of us are working because of our faith to make things better. So, so my first message is don't get discouraged. It's happening to a lot of institutions, and we have more to work with than most, starting with the people on this call.
Good segue into if you would like to share a short set of ideas. I'm going to ask you if you can find any of the little controls that have a hand that you could raise, or feel free to just, if you are on camera, I will look for you and ask you to speak for about a minute or less. Is there anybody looking at my first page, looking for somebody raising their hand? I see Jim McCarville.
I'm only doing that to show everybody.
Oh.
It's on the bottom of the screen. It's called reactions. And if you do that, you can get a thumbs up. And
I saw Father Vince Stegman was raising his hand.
Please, go ahead.
In our little group, I went back to the question that we ended up with before we broke up. Where do we go from here? And here in the diocese, at least, I think the thing we have to start with is the seminary. The whole program in the seminary, I think, has to be revised. I don't get around to many parishes, but I've been to a few, but I hear things from a lot of different people that they never hear anything from the pulpit or from the priests about any issue of covered by the Second Vatican Council. You know, they talk about whatever they talk about, but they seem to have no idea what the Second Vatican Council is all about and what it should mean to us today. And so I fault the bishop for that he hasn't done something to revise the program at the seminary over the last few years.
Thank you. Thank you. Who else would like to say something?
This is Bernie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead, Bernie.
Okay. I'm a member of the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests, John, and we're having you at our virtual assembly in June. And I'm going to tell the leadership of our assembly to fasten their seat belts. It's going to be a good session with you.
Well, you might recognize some of these ideas.
There you go. Okay. I don't care if you repeat it all again. I think it'll be well received.
I only have 8 ideas.
Okay. That's all I wanted to communicate. Anyone else? I turn
Jessica?
over the microphone.
Jessica?
Hi. Hello. So in our little group, everybody can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
In our little group, we talked about a couple things. One was the movement towards more common good, more community, and just the importance of that. And if we kind of feel like if we had a community goal or a common good that we were trying to work towards, a lot of this stuff would become more natural, right? Like some of these answers would kind of work out if that was really our goal, was what's good for the common good. The other was to get younger people involved, and one of the ways to do that is kind of what John was saying, was through that my phone's on. Some of that is through the corporal works of mercy. That's a good way to get younger people involved, is through those hands-on activities. And one of the other questions we just had was, what's the role of a pastoral council or the lay people if we find that our priests or our clergy or the clergy leadership just isn't moving forward and is just not willing to, I don't know, see the truth or move in a way that we think would be more beneficial for us, especially in the wake of, all the abuse crisis stuff. Just what's our role? What can we do? What's the role of the pastoral council as a group, and then as just individuals too, as lay people and parishioners? So those are the 3 things we talked about.
Thank you. I see there's some, Casey has her hand up, so I'll ask you, John, if you have time to stay around, maybe you can address some of that, but I'd like to get Casey's
Sure, I would like one last comment before you wrap up would be helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll come back to you. Casey?
Okay, I'm from the Wheeling-Charleston Diocese. My internet might cut out here. I'm kind of far out, but I live directly what used to be Wheeling Jesuit University, and they lost their affiliation because they cut all theophilosophy, and they basically, our diocese, beyond just the Jesuit university, they just destroyed all sense of community. Like, I lost my street all in one day. It's like, yeah, they've held some meetings for like lay Catholics, like lay Catholic Voices for Change, and these restorative justice meetings, but we were talking about in our breakout circles how it's just so vague ideas of what you like. I'm not getting anywhere with like Bishop Brennan or and I like Kevin Hayes has come down and spoke with our diocese a lot too, and we're all running into the same problems. It's just like we keep talking about the same stuff and it goes nowhere. So I kind of don't know what to do.
Thank you for voicing that. I'm not seeing anyone else, and these are
Geraldine had a question.
Okay. Geraldine?
Yes, hi, John, Jerry Socola. We knew each other way back.
How are you?
I'm really good. I was a groupie of yours, but first a groupie of Brian Hare's, I have to say. So in our little group, we talked about the fact that Catholic social teaching was not something we grew up learning. I was an adult. I was at CRS, and was charged with building that framework for the organization. And I had never heard about those principles. And in our little group discussion, everybody said the same thing. And, the question of if we were united, we would be a powerful force. I don't think that's going to happen unless all Catholics have that as part of their bloodstream. And I wonder if there's a way that we can storm the bishops to say this is imperative. Frankly, we wouldn't have had the immorality of the priests who abused children. We wouldn't have had the cover-up, which was dishonesty. We wouldn't have wealth of bishops and other clergy. We wouldn't have, bishops and priests who are afraid to speak out on the injustices in the country, in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if that was really part of really the lifeblood of the church. So I don't know how we bring about that change, but I think that it's rooted there. And I don't know, what your thoughts in. I think that would be where the transformation comes from.
Mhm.
Thank you. Mary Dara, you're on mute.
Mimi?
I just wanted to agree with the previous speaker, 125%. And in our little group, we talked about how we felt the church was stuck over the last 25, 30 years. And it is true that we need to get young people involved in hands-on, but we also have to connect them with justice in addition to charity projects. And I would agree that, Catholic social teaching, if you mentioned it to 99% of people in the parish, they've never heard of it. And it's the only thing that has kept me Catholic. So I just think it's how you get it into the parishes. Bishops can make all kinds of statements. Pope Francis can say all kinds of stuff, but we never hear about it in the parish. So we have to figure out a way to get it down into the parishes, starting with little kids in CCD. And with all the cutbacks, they're gutting those programs. So thank you.
Thank you. Sister Karen?
I just wanted to reaffirm Casey and her struggles of losing that. I can't imagine losing your college, losing its accreditation, and having this wonderful community and it being gone. And I just wanted to validate that for you. I don't have an answer though.
Yeah. I'm just trying to move forward and I don't know how. Like, that's how I even heard about this meeting going on, like coordinating with the Pittsburgh Diocese since they've gone through a similar situation. So,
Robert?
Yes. I know we were cautioned about not being political. We work with both. I work as an Ignatian volunteer in Virginia. And my experience has been, I've been working for this advocacy group, which started out as a Catholic advocacy group. Now it's very ecumenical. But what I've found in working with legislators in Richmond and trying to address some of the structures that cause us problems, that the Democrats get it when it comes to the principles of Catholic social teaching. There are a few Republicans that get it, but very few. That's just my observation after about 13 years of doing this. The other thing is the people who really understand Catholic social teaching are my Jewish friends. They get it. That's another group that gets it much better than the Catholics get it. And I don't know where to lay the blame. I don't even necessarily want to lay the blame. But one of the folks mentioned earlier about Catholics not being familiar. I think what you did, John Carr, the little Catholic social teaching document, I'm holding it up now, front and back, did a great job in summarizing. And unfortunately, it's not in every parish or every household. That's my 2 cents tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more and then we'd like to ask John to do a wrap up if there's anyone else who would like to say anything. I can't see, some of you are just, I don't see your faces or you're on mute on a phone or something. So
Glenn Miller is asking to get on.
Okay, Glenn, go ahead.
Glenn Miller's wife is talking. I just am thinking that maybe some of the steps that we have to think about, lay, clergy, any of us, is to listen to some of the voices that haven't been heard. So recently, John Carr was talking about the less of a voice from labor, but I think we're not hearing some of the things from the youth on some major issues. For instance, in an NCR article, I was stunned to think that they are not hearing anything from the Universal Church, or not much support for reducing gun violence. And that was so important for so many of the youth with Parkland and other. I just don't know if we're hearing voices of the issues that some of the young people would be wanting to say. Are they welcome in the church? Is their voice welcomed? And the issues that are important to them, one of those being reducing gun violence.
Thank you. Okay.
I think we want to give John a chance to wrap up, and
sure.
And we've gone over our time limit, but I think it's been a very, very interesting discussion.
Well, first, Casey, I can't imagine, frankly, what you've been through. I started out by saying that, let me get back here, that Washington and Pennsylvania had borne the burden. You don't want my taxes, God help us. But Wheeling, West Virginia, with the corruption of the bishop, is ground zero in terms of clericalism. And it just has to be so tough. I would think you might want to check with Catholic colleges and universities in Washington if you have an interest. I mean, you may want to stay in Wheeling, but there are a lot of Catholic colleges that are desperate for young leaders and are going to be trying to figure out a way to move forward, and maybe you can find another home. I knew Father Brennan, and he couldn't be more different than Bishop Bransfield. So you have that going for you. On Catholic social teaching, and thanks for the reference to the card, I find that everywhere. Maybe it's because I recognize the words and it's not in enough homilies and all the rest, but I think it is in textbooks. I think it is in CCD. And the students I teach have some notion. What they don't understand is that it's integral to the faith. And I think as some things have broken down, we have to go back to basics. And there's nothing more basic than Matthew 25, whatsoever you do for the least of these, or bringing good news to the poor and liberty to captives. To have a pope that puts this central, to have a community that is going back to the scriptures is all to the good. And so I'm actually a little bit hopeful about that as things crash in some ways, something new will take its place. A couple advertisements. One area for young people and others that is really needed right now, Bread for the World is the most impressive ecumenical Christian group working on hunger. It is the gospel in action. I have a bias, I'm chair of the board, and some of you I know involved. But if you don't have Catholic structures that help you make a difference, join Bread, because they make a difference. They're making a difference today. Secondly, join our efforts. I'm trying to show can you see the slide that has our email?
Yes.
Yes.
Write that down. It used to be you had to be in Washington to be a part of our programs. That's not the case right now. We have done a series of them. We're going to do one on moving beyond the life on hold for young people. We're going to do one in mid-May on global dimensions of the crisis. We're going to do one for Latino leaders. Copy down Catholic Social Thought, georgetown.edu. And there is an old document that still is very useful that the conference did called Communities of Salt and Light, which actually was sort of a recipe for integrating Catholic social thought into the life of the parish in a way that invites people in instead of pushing them away. And I think that can be a big help. I've used it in my own parish. And where I want to conclude is, first of all, with thanks and admiration. I don't know how all you did this wizardry. That's really impressive. I'm grateful to be invited originally and grateful that we found a way to make this online. If I don't know another group that's gathering 100 people tonight for how we can be better people and help our church be a better reflection of the gospel. So there's been a lot of talk about what we don't have yet. I think what you have is pretty impressive, and build on that. I tried to think of the last time I felt like this, and I show my age, but it was after 9/11. And that you might recognize the image is a cross, actually girders that became a cross at 9/11. And I had occasion to make a visit to Ground Zero shortly after it happened. And it was an overwhelming emotional, physical, spiritual experience. Smoke was still rising. There was silence as they brought out pieces of people. And I was there with a group of priests. One of the priests grabbed me and said, you know, when we were talking about last night, solidarity, human dignity, that's the only way we're going to overcome this. John, the work you're doing is more important than ever. And I looked at him, I said, Father, the work you're doing to proclaim the gospel, to apply it, to build community is more important than ever. And I would suggest at another time that has really broken open our nation and touched our church, the work you're doing as lay Catholics, as pastors, as alumni from Georgetown, as people working on the reform of the church, that work is more important than ever. And I am honored to be a small part of that work tonight. So thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. I think this is really calls for one more round of applause.
There's
There
a
you go.
nice
Okay.
little
There you go.
comment from a comment from Andy Beckman.
Okay.
You need to unmute yourself is a pretty good commission for lay people in our church today.
Andy.
I have one more announcement for everybody, because I want you to know that this has been recorded and it's available. If you want to use it with your small groups or large groups, just let me know. Or even if you want to just watch it individually, I think most of you've got my email, either the Association of Pittsburgh Priests.com or at Gmail, I'm sorry, or jimmccarville@gmail.com. And we'll work with you. The Association of Pittsburgh Priests and Pathways to Lay Leadership wants to work with you. They want to get this message out. This is a great message, and it's a great format to do it in. And we can help you with the technology as well. So thank you all for participating.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Jim, thank you. All your teammates there, thank you.